The following programme contains descriptions of real-life violence that some viewers may find distressing.
I haven't been back to the deposition site since. I convinced myself that the right thing to do was not to return, so I haven't returned. This will be the first time in 20 years that I've been back here.
On the 17th of August 2002, Detective Superintendent Russell Waite of Cambridgeshire Constabulary arrived at a track next to a remote countryside field for the first time. His presence there followed news which the whole force, and indeed the whole country, had been hoping wouldn't arrive.
I had a phone call from the Deputy Chief Constable telling me that 2 bodies had been found in Suffolk, not far from Lakenheath.
It had been just under 2 weeks since the small Cambridgeshire town of Soham and most of the world's media had been desperately waiting for 2 little girls to come home.
Holly Wells and Jessica Chapman were last seen playing together at Holly's home last night.
Police are urging anyone who's seen the 10-year-olds to come forward.
Like the rest of the nation, Soham waits for good news.
God is forgiven, just come home.
Anyone who's got children must know what we're going through.
Still, there's no clue nor apparent reason for Holly and Jessica's disappearance.
More than 100 local volunteers have joined the search for the girls.
We're concerned for their safety. We want to find them. We want to get them back home to their parents.
As the search widens, it's harder to stop hope from fading.
This is now a massive logistical operation for police.
We have to consider that they are being held against their will.
Officers have plenty of sightings of the girls, but not one of the abduction.
Holly and Jessica simply vanished. It's now ending as so many had feared, with the search for Holly and Jessica's bodies.
The 2 bodies were found in the early afternoon by a woman and 2 men out strolling along this remote track.
Suffolk Police had blocked off either side of the road. As soon as we went through a cordon, straight away my, not anxiety, but my energy levels seemed to rise because, you know, this was it. This was when I needed to do my investigative work. There wasn't many vehicles here. There was a police van, and also there was a scenes of crime van here. There was a do not cross police tape across the road just before you come to this lane here. But having got here, you know, I was now in charge.
Russell's first task was to ensure the crime scene was sealed off. and forensically secure.
What transpired when I arrived here was that there was 3 people here. And they were the gamekeeper that was looking after pheasants and a couple that driven down here. And the lady had smelt something. And as a result of that, the 3 of them walked back to the ditch, and that's where they saw the bodies lying in the ditch. They looked very shaken, understandably. So my initial actions were to make sure nobody else came down here, and we made a decision that it was not really possible to do the recovery of the girls' bodies that night because we thought daylight was going to go fairly quickly. So the best thing that we could do was to do a phased recovery. So the very first time I went actually down the lane to where the girls' bodies were lying was at 7:30 in the morning on that Sunday morning. I probably jealously guarded the site and the girls to a certain extent because I wanted everybody, including the investigation team, to remember them in those Manchester United shirts. Not what I was looking at, and I think because of that, that made that more of an imperative to me going forward.
That image of 2 little girls, Jessica Chapman and Holly Wells, in their football shirts, and the plight of their families waiting desperately for them to come home, had grabbed the attention of the world's media since they first went missing, nearly 2 weeks previously.
I didn't want anybody else going down here other than some specialists, but I had to make a decision who we were going to use first.
World-renowned paleontologist Patricia Wiltshire, a forensic expert on pollen and plant spores, was standing by.
It was decided that I would go in first. When I got there, it was really very quiet, except for the weather. And although there was sunshine, there were horrendous thunder and lightning storms. And when it rained, the raindrops were huge and battered you when they came down. They said, what we want you to do is to tell us how the murderer got into the ditch, because we can't see how he got in. The nettles were up chest height, and, you know, how could he have got in? So the first thing I did was walked very slowly up the bank and back again, and I could see 2, to me it was quite distinct, but faint paths, and I could see it very clearly that the nettles were trampled. And that led down straight to where the bodies were. So I said, well, this is your approach path. And when the scenes of crime officers went in, I said, oh, look. And there was Jessica's hair on a twig. So you can imagine the scenario. Someone had put the little girl over his shoulder, walked in, and her hair had got caught on a twig. It was Jessica's hair. got caught on the twig. And I noticed that there were steps in the bank where whoever had put the girls in there, because the police hadn't gone down into that ditch. I was the first person there. So it must have been the perpetrator's footprints. Brilliant place to get your soil samples from, because if he trod on those, the remnants of the soil would still be on his shoes.
Also present at the deposition site was forensic scientist Peter Lamb.
The senior investigating officer asked me if I would help to recover the bodies and to help recover as much evidence from the bodies as we possibly could before we removed them from the scene itself. And so in this particular case, I worked with the pathologist to take samples and to recover any extraneous fibres and material that might be present during the removal of the two little girls.
I'm trying to link that place with anything else that's pertinent. So the girls didn't have their clothes on, so their clothes must be somewhere. Would those clothes have the crime scene on them? Were they carried to the place in their clothes? Were they naked when they were taken there? That's all very relevant. And I did a vegetation survey of all the plants that were there that might be relevant and be on their clothing or be on the perpetrator's vehicle that they were brought to the place in. Now, I tried to work out where the vehicle would have been placed optimally. So get the two girls out of the car and carry them down the ditch. So I pretended in my mind's eye that the car was at this site. So I took samples from where someone might have stood where the boot was, someone might have stood where each back door was, each front door was, where the front wheels were, and so on. So the soil around that car, and it would be a mixed profile to some extent, would be on his shoes and possibly his clothes. And then when he got into the car, they would be put into the car. The track itself was very interesting. The vegetation all along on both sides was very interesting. Mostly common weeds, but nevertheless, the pollen of these weeds doesn't go very far. So if a vehicle touched them, and so they might be relevant. One thing they asked me then was, how long ago did it happen? Well, I was very lucky because plants are quite responsive and you can predict what they do. And if you tread on a plant, it will grow, continue growing, but it'll be flattened, but it'll start to grow up at the end. And this is because a plant is controlled by hormones from the tip. If you tread on it, the hormone flow is disrupted. The side shoots all shoot up, and they've got their own little tips then, and they will control whatever's at the back of their tips. And from looking at the structure of those side branches and the distance between the nodes, that's where the leaves come off, I said, oh, about 2 weeks. I'm pretty sure it's about 2 weeks.
Ten-year-old Jessica Chapman and Holly Wells were last seen playing together at Holly's home yesterday. When Holly's parents went to check on them in the evening, they'd vanished. The girls don't appear to have taken any money or clothes with them. A member of the public spotted them in a street nearby later, and it's thought they might have been walking towards the centre of Soham to buy sweets. Residents around Soham are now being asked to check their gardens and sheds and to contact the police if they saw anybody behaving suspiciously.
Brian Farmer was a local news reporter for the Press Association at the time.
It was just a quiet little town like lots of other towns. I think that's part of the horror. It was hard to believe that two 10-year-old girls could vanish. It's such an ordinary, nondescript little place on a sunny afternoon in August. It was difficult to believe that they could go missing.
On Sunday, the 4th of August, the two girls met up. They were part of a fairly close group of friends that went to the local primary school, and so they wandered between their two homes. The Wells family had a barbecue.
During the barbecue, Holly had put on her Manchester United top with Beckham and the number 7 on the back. Jessica hadn't got one, so she borrowed Holly's brother's Manchester United top, and they'd put on their Manchester United tops and gone out for a walk. This is the route Holly and Jessica would have taken. They'd passed the sports centre where I think they'd stopped off to go and get crisps and sweets and so on. And then they'd have walked around here and down in this direction. And they'd have looked at this little stream and noticed the ducks. How could they be in any danger walking down a quiet little place like this on a sunny August afternoon?
Well, when Jessica didn't come home, her mum was very concerned, spoke to the Wells family, and they went out looking. Kevin Wells and I think his brother and other family members went out looking for the girls, and ultimately, I think it was Mrs. Chapman phoned the police to say that my daughter and Holly have gone missing.
On Sunday, the 4th of August, 2002, a small town in the heart of the Cambridgeshire countryside changed forever. From that day, the whole world would know of Soham, where two 10-year-old girls, Jessica Chapman and Holly Wells, went for a walk but didn't come home.
On that Sunday evening, there was a lower resource level, and the sergeant went out to support her constable. So the first thing they did is take a missing from home report from both the families, and straight away felt that this was a vulnerable missing from home, which you would expect with two 10-year-old girls anyway, and asked for her inspector and asked for all resources to go and help that was available. The next morning, there was a detective inspector allocated to look at the two girls being missing from home, and they went to Soham, and then they went and made inquiries in the area, plus had some detectives with them doing, house-to-house inquiries, checking Holly and Jessica's friends, if they'd heard anything from them. Jessica had a phone, and it was checking, had her phone been used. So all of those sort of investigations started on that next morning.
Obviously, we're very concerned indeed. Two 10-year-olds being out overnight. It's now many hours since they were last seen. We're obviously very concerned to find them and to make sure that they are safe and well.
A whole community wants best friends Holly Wells and Jessica Chapman back home. Hundreds of volunteers queued to search for a second night for the two missing girls.
Well, there is a hope that they're still together and hopefully offering one another encouragement and support. They're both two bright girls. It's completely out of character, and really it's a great shock.
By the end of that morning, people would think that there's something that was sinister that happened, and that two 10-year-old girls shouldn't have gone missing from home. If it was in the winter, you might think about hypothermia, or you might think that they've gone into water. So there always is that worry that that may have happened. However, it was a very small likelihood because there were 2 of them. So straight away, people were starting to think that this is suspicious.
This was the biggest case that Cambridgeshire Constabulary had ever faced, so it needed their best senior investigating officer in charge. That man was Detective Chief Superintendent Chris Stevenson.
They still hadn't appeared by Monday evening, and by that time the concerns were rising very rapidly. And a major investigation was launched, which really got underway on the Tuesday morning, by which time the concerns were, of course, huge.
More than 100 police officers have searched fruitlessly for 2 days and nights. Still, there's no clue, nor apparent reason for Holly and Jessica's disappearance. But what is certain is that it's breaking their parents' hearts.
We've had an experienced friends and family searching in ditches, in rivers, looking for shallow graves for our children.
Holly and Jessica were playing at Holly's house on Sunday before they disappeared. The girls were dressed similarly in Manchester United T-shirts.
It transpired that Holly's mum, I think it was, had taken a picture of them in their Manchester United shirts, and it was still in her camera. So the police went and got the photograph developed. The strangest and saddest thing, it was the clock behind them. It was just a little after 5. I can still see it. Kind of captures their last moments.
And detectives hoped that other cameras had also recorded the girls that afternoon. They turned to the town's small CCTV network to piece together their movements and to see who, if anyone, they might have met.
There have been 2 possible sightings of them, but now the grim realisation that police believe the girls may have been abducted.
It was quite clear that we were going to need a large team of officers, of family liaison officers, to deal and look after the families in this case. So we put together a team under a chief inspector, and we had 2 sergeants, 4 constables, so there was plenty of flexibility within that team to ensure that the families were given as much support as we possibly could.
The media intrusion, I'll call it that, for the families was quite extreme, and we needed to manage that for the family's sake.
Yeah?
Okay, take this, Ollie. 2 minutes, we'll be enjoying you. It'll go straight away live. Okay.
Once it became apparent that this was at the centre of the biggest news story in the country, it became busy, you know, because everyone was around and the place was full of journalists and the police, so it became a slightly unreal situation pretty quickly, because it suddenly didn't become an ordinary town. It became a town where full of people, you know, journalists with cameras and things were walking about.
We're up and running again now if you need us.
And then I'm going to do another one with a slight variation on the end.
I was asked to set the incident room up, and we started off with about 6 staff, and that quickly wasn't enough.
We needed our control room to be supported by detectives and search specialists from around the country.
Detective Inspector Martin Underhill was brought in from Sussex Police as one of a number of consulting detectives. He had experience investigating other high-profile cases.
We arrived on the Wednesday morning and really just there as support, because Cambridgeshire's a much smaller force than Sussex. Cambridgeshire's got 1,000 officers, and cases this size and this profile, they have 1,000 police officers working on them. So effectively every police officer in Cambridgeshire was looking for Holly and Jessica. And how do you carry on normal policing? Someone was getting over 1,000 phone calls a day. How do you process that? And how do you make sure you don't lose that nugget of information which solves the case? And we said to them, get a flower grader into your control room. A flower grader is what we called an experienced detective sergeant, who screened every call coming in and picked out the nuggets, so that you're not parking the other 950 calls, but you're taking the top 50 every day to try and solve where they are. Where are Holly and Jessica?
And in their efforts to answer that question, forensic investigators were already being dispatched to the girls' homes.
The first things that I did in this case was to try and establish some basic knowledge about the two little girls. So we wanted to develop DNA profiles so that if the worst came to the worst, we were able to either eliminate or include findings within this inquiry. The easiest method was to gather things like toothbrushes and hairbrushes that the little girls had used, and to use the material from them to extract DNA and then provide DNA profiles from there. Obviously, these were then kept to one side just in case anything was found where we could make comparisons.
This is now a massive logistical operation for police, as well as extending their search out beyond the fringes of Soham and into the Cambridgeshire fenland. They're also sifting through thousands of calls from members of the public anxious to help. Today's reconstruction of the last known movements of Holly and Jessica will doubtless bring in yet another flood of information.
The police had a press conference, and I remember a few journalists talking to them about sightings. They'd released several possible sightings of Holly and Jessica in and around the village. And we asked the senior detective at the press conference, if it was possible that they could put their heads together and produce a timeline, so to say that they were seeing at this time there and at that time there. And on the press conference on the Thursday morning, which would have been the 8th, they produced a timeline. The timeline showed that they'd spoken to the caretaker of Soham Village College outside his house and then carried on past. And as far as they were aware at that stage was he was the last person to have seen them. And I knew where the caretaker's house was. I didn't know who the caretaker was, but I wandered over, knocked on the door, and after a few seconds, a woman opened the door. And what I do remember is she didn't open the door fully. She kind of held it open and poked her head around it, sort of thing. And I said hello, explained to her who I was, explained that the police had said that the caretaker had spoken to the girls before they went missing. We were just trying to find the caretaker, and was he in? And he came to the door, and then we started a conversation. And I wasn't anticipating a problem in the caretaker telling me about it at all. But to my surprise, they were a little bit reticent. They said they didn't want to talk to the press. But after a little bit of conversation, they agreed that I could go in. So I took out my notebook, and the first thing that I checked was their names. And they were Maxine Carr and Ian Huntley. Fairly early on in the conversation, it became apparent, or Maxine Carr said, that she'd actually worked at the school. She was a classroom assistant. She worked at the school, and she'd known Holly and Jessica. She knew them well. Well, that was news to me. I had no idea. And Holly and Jessica had signed a card for her, which she showed us. The first strange thing that happened was that I asked Maxine Carr if at the school they'd been looking at stranger danger kind of issues. Had they done that with the children? Don't get into strangers' cars. And she said yes, they had, as all schools did. And I said to her, from what you know of Holly and Jessica, say, for example, a man has pulled up in a car as they're walking and said, girls, jump in, I'll give you a lift. How would they have reacted? And before Maxine Carr had the chance to answer, Ian Huntley answered the question. And he said, well, Holly would probably get in and go quietly, but Jessica would put up a fight. And immediately I thought, well, how can he know? And as he was talking, he was emotional and upset. It was almost as though he was too emotional. It was almost as though they were relatives. And that immediately made me think, this is strange. It was just such a bizarre thing to say. So we then switched my attention to Ian Huntley, and we started talking about what had happened on the Sunday.
Although Brian was the first reporter to hear Huntley's version of events, he wasn't the last.
Ian Huntley here is a familiar figure. Evening, Ian. Evening. You're the school caretaker. The girls, Jessica and Holly, would know you, and they saw you on the front doorstep. What went on?
Well, I don't know the girls. I stood on the front doorstep grooming my dog down. She'd run away and come back a bit of a mess. They just came across and asked how Miss Carr was, as she used to teach them at St Andrews. I just said she weren't very good, as she hadn't got the job. And they just said, please tell her that we're very sorry. And off they walked in the direction of the library over there.
What troubled me, I couldn't really imagine there were two girls on Earth who would be walking around on a sunny August afternoon who would come across a man washing a great big hairy dog with a hose and soap, and they wouldn't mention the dog. It just seemed inconceivable. An adult would have mentioned the dog, let alone a girl. So I went over it with him several times and said, well, exactly what did they say? Again and again, and he said the same thing. And I thought, this is very, very strange.
Soham was bathed in sunshine today, but no one was enjoying a summer break. Mixed with the anxiety is the continued astonishment at how two young girls could disappear without a trace from under their noses.
August 2002. The UK was gripped by the disappearance of two 10-year-old girls, Jessica Chapman and Holly Wells, who hadn't been seen for nearly a week since they went for a walk one Sunday evening in their hometown of Soham in Cambridgeshire. As police and locals searched desperately to find them, hope was diminishing by the day.
After leaving Holly's home one Sunday evening, they wandered down the high street to a spot close to this garage. At 6:13, they were caught on CCTV cameras crossing the car park at the local sports centre. 3 minutes later, they spoke to the caretaker of their school outside his home, just a few hundred yards from the sports centre.
His name was Ian Huntley. He was thought to be the last person to have seen and spoken to Holly and Jessica before they disappeared. Journalist Brian Farmer went to interview Huntley at his home. Huntley's partner, Maxine Carr, was also there.
We asked him, can we just take your picture too? And he said, oh no, I don't want my picture. I said, well look, you know, it's not about you being shy. Somebody might have seen you with the girls, and they might have seen where they might have noticed you. It possibly won't, but it just might help. What harm can it do? And he wouldn't, and he got quite aggressive about it. And he said the strange thing that I've never forgotten. He said, even my mother doesn't have a picture of me. Nobody takes a picture. Well, call me an old cynic, but, you know, the reason people don't want their pictures often taken is because if someone sees them, they'll recognise them.
All the press have been hounding us, trying to get pictures, statements,
and what have you. And I just wish that I had said or found out more about where they was going or what they was doing. You know, in hindsight, you just wish you'd said or done something more.
Ian Huntley was now on the radar of journalists. Police, however, had been suspicious of him from the start.
On the evening that the girls reported missing, one of the dog handlers that went to the missing from home report came across Ian Huntley.
He was the caretaker, and of course that was very handy for the dog handler, because he said, I've got all the keys, I can open the gates for you and enable you to search. And he and the dog handler spent about an hour searching the school premises. But he never mentioned to the dog handler that he'd spoken to these two girls. And then later in the night, he mentioned to a teacher who'd come out, because by now the community are out in force, that he thought he'd spoken to these two girls. And that is a classic behaviour by an offender. He was placing himself into the investigation in case anybody had seen him talking to the girls.
The initial search team weren't the only ones to notice the caretaker. Special Constable Sharon Gilbert was one of the extra forces brought in to police the area around Soham College, where Holly and Jessica had last been seen.
When we arrived at the college, we did the handover with the people that were already there, and she said that the caretaker had actually been milling round and was sort of getting in everybody's way. So when we actually parked up, he actually came up and then lounged on my door, and I guessed straight away that he was the caretaker before he'd even introduced himself as Ian Huntley, the caretaker for Soham Village College. My first impression straight away was he's a very strange person. Because from introducing himself, just very relaxed, leaning on the hinge and the side compartment of the door. We then went straight into a conversation of how long does DNA evidence last in the ground, and for anybody to ask you that, then there's a reason why they're asking it. They're not going to just out of the blue ask you that unless they're hiding something. I said, I think that it'll last forever. DNA will never disappear. There was no reaction, really. There wasn't any reaction from him with anything that was said. His face was just taking things in, but not expressionate or anything, just a blank canvas almost. And he then went on to talk about aircraft, about how he was a plane spotter and he went to Milden Hall and Lakenheath, and was it true that the police were going to be using an aircraft to look for shallow graves around the area. He also told us that the previous caretaker had left under suspicious circumstances and had a set of keys for the building, so if anything was ever found in the building, it would be him that had put it there. I then went and reported it to my sergeant as we were doing the handover, and reported everything that he'd said to me that I thought was suspicious.
But the suspicions weren't grounds enough to make an arrest. Detectives needed proof and new tactics. Nationally recognised hostage negotiator David Beck attempted to make contact with the girl's potential kidnapper.
He sent a text message to Jessica's mobile phone, which is identical to this one. The message contains a number which will be open until midnight.
I appeal to you again to work with me to stop this getting any worse than it is. You do have a way out. I have left you a personal message and a text message on Jessica's mobile phone. Listen to that message. It will tell you how to contact me so that we can stop this now.
The deadline passed, and if the girls were still alive and being held, their captor didn't come forward. But there were other ways in which Jessica's mobile phone may reveal clues. Detectives now look to the relatively new forensic field of digital analytics.
Initially, the Force Control Room contacted the service provider. They were told that the phone had powered down at 1 a.m, some distance outside Soham. So consequently, the searches were focused around that area. It wasn't until we got a forensic expert in that we found that the information that we'd been given by this service provider was incorrect. And that refocused the inquiry completely.
Angus Marshall is a digital forensic expert.
The significant event in the phone data was when the phone was switched off. Now, mobile phones, when they are switched off, are quite polite and actually say goodbye to the network and transmit a signal that tells the network, I'm switching off, you can reuse the bandwidth that you'd reserved for me. The phone itself also records the cell it was last active in. So what happened was that as the phone was switched off, it communicated with the mast it was connected to. Turned out that the cell where the phone had gone to sleep did provide coverage, and that coverage extended to cover the house where Huntley was living.
Finally, tangible evidence pointing to one location and one man.
There was an argument which said, this man is a suspect because of the information from the forensic telecoms engineer, the fact that he'd spoken to them and appears to be the last person to speak to them. So I could have arrested him. I could have had him arrested on suspicion of involvement in the disappearance of Holly and Jessica. But I was concerned that they may still be alive. If Holly and Jessica are held somewhere and I arrest Huntley and they die of starvation because he's in custody for 4 days, I could never forgive myself. So I decided to interview Huntley as a significant witness, which meant putting him on tape, and I called in 2 very experienced interviewers to do that for me.
What I'd like you to do for me now is describe the girls to me, their whole physical appearance, okay?
Blonde hair, shoulder length, very slim, I'd say thin.
And it was during that interview when he was asked about describing the girls and what they were wearing that he had a bit of a wobble. And then his head goes down. And it's 55 seconds later before anything is said. There is total silence. And when I saw that bit of film, I was pretty sure that this was the man that we needed to focus on.
While this interview was taking place, Chris's team was simultaneously questioning Ian Huntley's girlfriend, Maxine Carr, who had already provided her partner with an alibi. She claimed to have been in the bath when Ian Huntley supposedly saw and spoke to the girls outside his house.
I've asked him 14 times what they said. Did they actually ask for me? Which directions did they come in?
Yeah.
Did they say where they were going? Did they say anything about barbecue?
I mean, I've made him feel like a suspect in his own right, really, because I just keep sort of... Well, he's sure they didn't say anything else all the time.
A 28-year-old man and a 25-year-old woman, both from the Soham area, have been spoken to by police officers and have agreed to give witness statements to us. They've both been taken to police stations elsewhere in the county for that purpose. A police search team is about to start carrying out a detailed examination of their house in Soham for any evidence that may point to the whereabouts of the two missing girls, Holly Wells and Jessica Chapman.
Huntley and Carr left their interviews and were immediately placed under close police surveillance.
And if there was a possibility that those girls were alive and Ian Huntley knew where they were, by putting them under surveillance, he would take us to them.
Meanwhile, Chris Stevenson demanded that the school where Huntley worked be searched again.
And then about 11 o'clock that evening, I'm at headquarters, working out where we're going from now. That I had a call from the search commander who told me there'd been a significant find. In a building associated with the school, it contained sports and maintenance equipment, and there were some bins in there. And underneath a full bin of rubbish were the girls' shirts and clothing. I asked the search commander what state the clothing were in, and he said they're not good. They'd be burnt and set fire to. And that really meant that all hope was lost. We just had to kick in and think about the implications that brought. One of the primary ones was letting the families know. And we had a discussion as to whether to let them know at midnight or to let them know at 7 o'clock in the morning. And in the end, I decided that we would call the family liaison team out at 5 a.m. and brief them, and then have them waiting outside the door at 7 with the news. Clearly, it was going to have an impact on everybody, as it did.
Yeah, we're about to get the statement.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen.
It's coming now, the statement.
In the early hours of this morning, police search teams recovered from Soham Village College items of major interest to our inquiry to trace the missing 10-year-olds, Holly Wells and Jessica Chapman. These items have been preserved at the scene and will be subject to a comprehensive forensic examination. Meanwhile, the search of the entire site at the college continues. In the last few hours, a 28-year-old man and a 25-year-old woman have been arrested. The 28-year-old man has been arrested for the murder and abduction of Holly Wells and Jessica Chapman. The 25-year-old woman has been arrested for the murder of both girls.
From that morning on, the case changed, and the biggest missing persons search in Cambridgeshire Constabulary's history became their biggest murder inquiry.
We needed to find two bodies. And where do you start looking in an area as vast as the Fens of Cambridgeshire? It really is the proverbial needle in a haystack job.
No possible clue is being overlooked. The detectives know they have only one chance to get this right.
It's now ending, as so many had feared, with the search for Holly and Jessica's bodies.
Then that Saturday afternoon, the door opened and in walked one of my DIs who said, "There's been a finding of two bodies in Suffolk." You just have to stop, take stock, and evaluate where you are and who's going to do what.
I took a call on a Saturday morning from the Deputy Chief Constable telling me that 2 bodies had been found in the Suffolk police area, and could I go as the senior investigating officer to manage that deposition site and supervise the recovery of those 2 girls' bodies.
In August 2002, the UK had been focused on one news story: 2 missing 10-year-old girls, Jessica Chapman and Holly Wells. Finally, the development came, which no one had wanted to hear. 2 bodies had been found. While investigators worked to identify them, their hometown of Soham was in shock.
Local people endure each long day as best they can.
It's very subdued. The town is very quiet. The place seems different somehow. You can't pinpoint what's different, but it is different somehow.
The effect on the population of Soham is absolutely immense. Nothing like this has ever happened before.
I don't think Soham will ever get over it. Sorry.
That glimmer of hope is snuffed out. It's gone. All that we've held on to is... sorry.
Things like this don't happen in a little market town in East Cambridgeshire.
In charge of the crime scene, where the 2 as yet unidentified bodies had been found, was Detective Superintendent Russell Waite.
All the time I was here, in particular that Sunday, I was very focused on talking to the family liaison officers and telling them what sort of things we were doing.
Could you go back beyond the coast?
Because it was their 2 little girls, and the world were looking in on the investigation, but at least they would know first that we were as sure as we could be at that stage that it was Holly Wells and Jessica Chapman. And then we let the world know, so we went, and the Deputy Chief Constable went to the church in Soham, in the churchyard there with all of the flowers, and he told the world's media.
It may be some days yet before we are able to positively identify the 2 bodies found at Common Drove near Lakenheath in Suffolk yesterday lunchtime.
I took the team actually back from the site then to listen to that.
However, we are certain, as we possibly can be tonight, that they are those of Holly and Jessica.
I was emotional because suddenly it dawned on me that actually, you know, this was the 2 girls' bodies. I wasn't just doing a job, I was then suddenly a spectator listening to it rather than somebody carrying out their professional role.
Can I suggest we just pause a moment in silence, in memory of these 2 little girls, and out of respect for their families and their many hundreds of friends.
And finally, when the forensic scientists had finished their work at the scene, the two little bodies were carefully removed and brought back to their families.
The pathologist was unable to give a cause of death because of the effects of the weather, the water, the insects that were present in an open field and ditch.
But the pathologist was very much of the opinion that these girls had died as a result of third party, that there were not accidental deaths, but suffocation, strangulation would be the most likely cause of the death.
Even for this highly experienced team of forensic scientists, detectives and police officers, this case and this deposition site were particularly challenging.
Being there that long with these two little girls lying side by side was hard. You'd seen pictures of them in the newspaper in their red football shirts and on the television smiling, and this was a very different picture. And it was hard. It was hard to take. It was hard to take.
It is quite a difficult task to do, but most people who are working in that sort of environment do it because they want to see justice done.
With the discovery of the girls' bodies, police and forensic investigators needed to find more evidence that linked them to the two suspects in custody. That search now centred on Ian Huntley's house.
My colleague went along, and when she returned, she commented on how clean the house was. It transpired that Mr. Huntley, the caretaker of the school, had access to vast quantities of cleaning material, including bleach. We never did find any DNA evidence, and it may have been the bleach which destroyed any.
Not a trace of blood or a strand of hair. If the girls had been inside the house, investigators would need to find alternative sources of contact.
At separate police stations in the county, the questioning of the two suspects in the case will continue overnight. 28-year-old Ian Huntley is suspected of the abduction and murder of both girls. His partner, 25-year-old Maxine Carr, suspected of involvement in the murders.
I quickly received a message to say that Maxine Carr wanted to be interviewed. She wanted to tell the truth. And two officers interviewed her, and she admitted that she'd lied in the previous interview, the significant witness interview on the previous day, and that in fact she'd been in Grimsby. And she wasn't in Soham on the Sunday night. We believe that that was on the instructions of Huntley and not involve herself anymore in the investigation. The issue about Maxine Carr was about why she lied. And only Maxine Carr knows the answer to that.
Carr's confession meant Huntley no longer had an alibi for the Sunday when the girls disappeared. Now detectives wanted to delve into his past.
Once we started looking at Huntley, we contacted the police at Grimsby, Humberside, with the constabulary. They told us they'd had Huntley in their intelligence system because his name was there, but there was no intelligence. Because of the data protection, it had been weeded off. I sent a team of my own detectives up there, and within 24 hours they were beginning to find, from their investigations, various background issues regarding Huntley that proved to be very relevant. and we soon found out that he had involvement with the police and young girls in Grimsby many times. He'd been charged with rape on one occasion, and the case was dismissed after he spent a week in custody by the CPS, who decided that there was insufficient evidence. But he'd also been involved in indecent assaults with young girls that he hadn't even been cautioned for.
Chris and his team were not about to make the same mistake. They needed enough concrete evidence to present the case to the UK's Crown Prosecution Service.
Forensic results will play a key role in this case, unravelling the unanswered questions about how, when and where the girls were killed. Evidence that will be crucial to a successful prosecution.
That evidence was beginning to come to light.
Inside the house, there would have been fibres from Mr. Huntley's and also Maxine Carr's clothes on the settee, on the carpet, and such like. And we started to pick up fibres from their clothing on the Manchester United top and the tracksuit bottoms that the girls were wearing. And during that phase, there were some fibres which were quite easily recognisable. There was dialogue between me and the senior officers along the lines of, I'm starting to find some turquoise fibres. They're quite long and quite fine, and I think they might belong to something like a jumper or a fluffy item of some description. Can you find some at the house? In that particular incident, they came back with a fluffy jumper that belonged to Maxine Carr. And we were able to show they were the same. Another time we found some very short fibres, and these particular fibres were characteristic of what's called flock material. You might find them on upholstery or curtains. And the police went to the house and found a pair of curtains which we were able to match as well. And so that enabled us to say that there was compelling evidence to show that the girls had been in contact with items relating to Mr. Huntley and Maxine Carr. We also found some hairs mixed with the clothing that the two girls had worn. And these hairs were indistinguishable in microscopic structure and colour to Mr. Huntley's hair. In order to establish with more certainty that these hairs came from Mr. Huntley and not from someone else, we undertook a process called mitochondrial DNA testing. And the results showed that the mitochondrial sequence of Mr. Huntley's hair was exactly the same as the sequence on the hairs recovered from the girls' clothing.
The school's storage unit, where the girls' burnt clothes had been found, was also beginning to provide the forensic team with important evidence.
The fingerprint department had found 3 or 4 fingerprints, full identifications, on the black bin liner that was concealing the girls' burnt clothes. That was crucial.
And these fingerprints were in such a way that that person would have been the one who put that black bin liner on top of the semi-burnt clothing. And these were in Huntley's fingerprints.
The team had established forensic links between the girls and Ian Huntley. Now they needed to link him to the crime scene where the bodies were found.
I was given the girls' burnt clothing, and it was amazing because there was loads of tree fruits and twigs and bits of twig and plant debris on the clothing from the crime scene. Particularly alder, the alder tree. There was a big alder tree bowing over the ditch, and it had all the last year's fruits on it, and they're like little cones, and they will stick to your clothes. It's difficult, you have to rip them off. And they were covered, the clothing was covered in that. So we know that they were clothed when they were put in the ditch, and he had taken the clothing off them while they were in the ditch, then took the clothing back to the school and burnt it.
A picture of events was becoming clearer as to what had happened to the girls and how Huntley had attempted to cover his tracks.
The girls' clothing had been cut. So there were zigzag, jagged cuts as if scissors had been used to cut through the material, presumably to enable them to be removed. The cutting of the garments creates more fibres which are available to be transferred to either the surface that they're being cut on or the person that's doing the cutting, or any surface that those items then come into contact with afterwards. Because the clothing of the girls was cut from them and then transported to the game shed where they were found in the bin. This may explain why there were so many fibres found during our investigations.
One place where the red fibres were found was Ian Huntley's red Ford Fiesta. This showed a likelihood that the girls' bodies had been moved in the car and that their clothes were then transported back from the crime scene before being put in the yellow bin. But initial investigations linking the car to the track were proving difficult.
The tyres on the Ford Fiesta owned by Huntley were brand new, and they were so new that the rubber mouldings were still on the tread. And it turned out that on the Monday, having taken the girls to the deposition site that he'd chosen, he then went to the garage in Ely and changed all 4 tyres. And he actually asked the mechanic to put a false index number on the receipt. He was that careful, he didn't want to be caught. That meant that any tyre tracks at the location weren't matching his Ford Fiesta.
Now the pressure was on Chris Stevenson and the forensic teams to link Huntley's car to the isolated country lane where Holly and Jessica had finally been found.
We understand that you've been charged, and under certain circumstances we are allowed to ask you questions even after you've been charged. And those are to do with ambiguities and also where new evidence has come to light since you've been charged. All right? Do you understand that?
Don't speak to me.
And what I was going to say, Ian, is that that is what we want to speak to you about.
August 2002. Soham school caretaker Ian Huntley had been charged with the murders of 10-year-old Holly Wells and Jessica Chapman. The charges against his partner Maxine Carr had now been lessened to perverting the course of justice and would later be extended to assisting an offender. The country's anguish and tears had turned into anger and rage.
The small crowd when Ian Huntley arrived had grown to around 200 by the time he was driven away. When his fiancée, Maxine Carr, made her first court appearance, police struggled to control a crowd of more than 500.
The couple had remained in custody since being charged. With initial searches of their home having revealed very little forensic evidence, investigators now began more detailed analysis of Ian Huntley's belongings. The main focus, his car.
It was believed that the car was the mode of transport in order to transport the two girls out of Soham and taken to the deposition site.
But Ian Huntley had changed all 4 tyres on his car, so forensic investigators would need to explore other parts of the vehicle in their hunt for evidence.
It was crucial that we examine the car from a forensic point of view to do with that track. Was anything from that within the car? The botany that was in the deposition site was quite unique to there. Was any of that in the car? So it was crucial that we took possession of that car and examined it in detail, but forensically in detail rather than just searching it.
The woodland deposition site where Jessica and Holly's bodies had been found was full of a variety of plants. Now paleontologist Patricia Wiltshire looked for evidence of their pollen and spores on and inside Huntley's car.
Huntley washed underneath the engine with a hosepipe because he'd forgotten that the soil would be washed up underneath the bonnet. So it's very difficult for them to get away with completely cleansing a car or clothing, come to that. So there's a lot of evidence there. And whoever had trodden on the soils at the crime scene would have taken them back to the inside of the car. So I did the pedals and the footwells and the boot, and I got good samples from them. Once we'd got the car over the inspection pit, I jumped down inside the inspection pit and tickled the chassis. And there was the piles of it, chalky soil, actually on one of the cross members. And would you believe, the spare wheel? Because the spare wheel in that model of car was underneath and outside, and that had picked up pollen and spores from the whole length of the drove. And one of the pollen types in particular was a plant called Artemisia. This is the mugwort. There were huge banks of mugwort all down the drove, and the car must have been picking, it was in the soil, you'd been picking it up all the way down.
From that soil, Patricia was able to extract pollen which matched the sample she had collected from the deposition site of Jessica and Holly's bodies.
It's not a perfect match, it never can be. It's like a jigsaw puzzle with some pieces that don't match the picture, but most do, so you can still see the picture even though some are wrong.
To support Patricia's findings and strengthen the prosecution's case, leading forensic geologist Andrew Moncrief was brought in to analyse the soil from the track to see if it could be linked to Huntley's car.
As part of my work, I was given statements taken from the farmer who owned the land, and in that he described what he'd been doing with the track. He'd been using rubble brought to him by builder friends. He then used a bulldozer to level it all out. So we had a big range of building materials and naturally occurring soil materials. And then because that left a very bumpy surface, he used chalk that he was digging out from his ditches elsewhere on the farm. Chalk being quite soft, it packs down very nicely to form a surface. And he was doing all of this with a bulldozer. And so as he was pushing the blade forward, material was spilling off the sides, forming these linear ridges on either side of the track. Now, to emplace the material into the underside of Huntley's car, the wheel would have had to go over, or the suspension would have to go over a raised pile. And it was very easy to see. And had somebody been driving, for instance, in the dark, without lights, then they could easily have wandered slightly off the track, put one wheel over the other side of a ridge, and lo and behold, all of that stuff will get scooped up.
This very particular geological formation of the track now provided Andrew with crucial evidence.
Chalk is incredibly powerful forensically because it contains millions upon millions of microfossils. And the beauty of this is that a micro-paleontologist can look at this material and can date that chalk extremely accurately. We had it dated to within a few 100,000 years, which in geological terms is spot on. We then compared that, of course, with the chalk and the other debris recovered from Ian Huntley's car, and they were of exactly the same age.
The picture starting to form was that Ian Huntley had driven the girls' clothed bodies to the ditch where he left them. Then, after asking Special Constable Sharon Gilbert about DNA, and before burning their clothes, he returned to set fire to their bodies.
It was obvious that what had caused the burning was powerful because the flames had reached very high, because there was a little birch tree and other shrubs too overhanging the girls, and it was burnt to a crisp. You could see that the flames must have been very high. Well, there are not many things that can do that. It's not slow burning. It's probably something like petrol. And I knew the Forensic Science Service had collected 2 petrol cans from Huntley. And I got this incredible profile of the crime scene. He must have put them down really in the stinging nettles, right on that bank. Whether he just threw the petrol over them from the bank, I just don't know. But it certainly, from the top of the bank, I had the profile.
Finally, the team of forensic scientists had compiled enough evidence to form a compelling case for prosecutors. And most of it had come from the very place Huntley had chosen to leave Jessica and Holly. It was the nature there, pollen, spores, soil and microfossils, which bore witness to Ian Huntley's crime, and which he unwittingly brought back into the hands of investigators. On the 5th of November 2003, the trial of Ian Huntley and Maxine Carr began at the Old Bailey, London.
Ian Huntley arrived at court shielded from the media glare inside a prison van.
The case against Ian Huntley was made by the prosecution in verbal evidence and on large television screens around the courtroom.
Forensic teams systematically stripped Huntley's home for anything that could help incriminate him.
The jury has already been told the keys to the hangar were found in the caretaker's house.
Chilling pictures were shown to the court of the 10-year-old's charred football shirts.
49 fibres from Holly and Jessica's football shirts were found either in the house or in Huntley's car.
The prosecution claimed Huntley's fingerprints were found on the bin.
Chalk from the road track was matched with samples on the inside and outside of his car.
Police had recovered the can Huntley had used to douse the bodies with petrol.
Samples from Huntley's shoes, car and a petrol can were linked to the Lakenheath site. Both Ian Huntley and Maxine Carr deny the charges against them.
Ultimately, he wanted to not be charged with murder. He wanted to be charged with manslaughter. But the prosecution rejected that, and the judge himself wasn't going to accept that sort of explanation.
Special Constable Sharon Gilbert, forensic scientist Peter Lamb, reporter Brian Farmer, and forensic paleontologist Patricia Wiltshire were all key witnesses for the prosecution. But the most eagerly awaited testimony came from the defendant himself, Ian Huntley.
He came across as somebody that was meek, mild, very quiet, tried to be very polite, and that's how he gave his evidence, in particular his evidence in chief for the defence, and then our prosecution barrister very much got under his skin.
He lost his temper, and he lost his temper just before lunch, and it was quite apparent because you could hear a pin drop after he'd come out with this comment. I can't remember what he said, but he was really angry. And the judge said, I think we'll adjourn for lunch at that point. And the impact of that on the jury must have been quite substantial. It was a telling moment in the trial, most definitely.
Jessica and Holly's families had endured 15 months without answers as to what had actually happened to their girls. Now they hope for the truth from Ian Huntley about how their daughters died.
Forensics were vital to this case. And when it was served on Huntley, that forced him to make admissions that the girls had died in his house.
Through his barrister, what he said was that he had been washing his dog, who'd got messy, and so there was some bath water in the bath. Holly had gone up to the bathroom, and she subsequently had slipped, fallen, and drowned in that bath water. He had gone upstairs, and when he turned around, Jessica was in the doorway screaming. And he had put his hand around her face, throat, and she collapsed and she died. And so he was giving an explanation that's how those two girls came to die within his house, accidentally almost.
He demonstrated in court how he put his hand over her mouth. But as the pathologist said, somebody would have had to be pressing the back of her head for her to be suffocated in that way. It just couldn't happen. And he said, two 10-year-old girls dying in this way, it's just not natural.
The parents of Holly Wells and Jessica Chapman have made the journey from Soham to the Old Bailey each day of this 6-week trial and are expected back in Court 1 as the judge prepares to send the jurors out to consider their verdicts. Mr. Justice Moses has already warned the 7 women and 5 men not to be overawed by the gravity of the alleged offences and to put aside anything they have seen or heard outside the courtroom.
Finally, after months of forensic investigation, police work by hundreds of officers and legal representation from teams of lawyers, the decision was down to 12 ordinary people.
The jury were advised by the judge. Both the prosecuting and defence barristers had done closing arguments, and then they went out to make their decisions on the charges of murder of Holly Wells, murder of Jessica Chapman for Ian Huntley, and then perverting the course of justice and assisting an offender for Maxine Carr. So the jury did go out to consider that verdict.
After 17.5 hours of deliberations, the 7 women and 5 men of the jury took their places in an utterly silent Court 1. The judge had told them he'd accept majority decisions. Huntley and Carr stood together in the dock.
That decision was a majority verdict. They found Maxine Carr guilty of perverting the course of justice, but acquitted her of assisting an offender. She was sentenced to 42 months in prison. Ian Huntley was found guilty of the murders of Holly Wells and Jessica Chapman. He was given 2 life sentences with a minimum term of 40 years.
I had an immediate feeling of relief first, and then thanks for the family, really, because both of the families then at least had a bit of closure in terms of the criminal justice process. Never closure, because those girls will always be their daughters and always go with them. But I had some relief for them.
It's difficult to feel anything about Ian Huntley. He got what he deserved, which is life imprisonment. I hope he's never released. And I hope he spends the rest of his life reflecting on what he did. And I hope that the fact that he was caught, captured, and imprisoned for the whole of his life will deter other paedophiles in the future.
My personal opinion is that Ian Huntley is somebody that must be a psychopath. Within an instant, he'd lost his temper and killed two 10-year-old girls. I'm not a clinical psychologist, but I don't think there's any other way you could describe somebody that would take human life like he did.
The psychological effects of the case were felt by all those who worked on it. Over a year after the suspicious conversation she'd had with Ian Huntley, Special Constable Sharon Gilbert, who'd been called to give evidence against him, was still struggling to come to terms with her experience.
It makes you feel absolutely awful, and you can't protect your children all the time. As a mum, I went through hell because of my children. He was walking around living his life, and he'd taken the lives of those two poor children and their parents. Their children would never come back.
August is always a difficult month, and every year there's an anniversary, and these were two 10-year-old girls with their future in front of them, and it was cut short.
Over 2 decades have passed since the day Holly and Jessica went for a walk they never returned from, and the village of Soham became famous for a story it can never escape.
So there'll be lots of young men and women here who are around 30 who will have grown up with them and played football with them and that, and it can't ever go away, can it? It never goes away. The very word, Soham, it means Holly and Jessica, doesn't it? It's beyond belief. That's the reason why, I think. And it lingers on forever, and I guess it'll linger on after I've gone, but it's sad.